natural process of reasoning, all of that is changed by emotion. So you're constantly changing the way your cognition operates, and part of that is actually induced by the emotion itself. Even the kind of things that you think about, the kind of material you recall from memory when you're having an emotion is tied to the signal of the emotion. You do not have the same kinds of recalled material if you're sad and if you are very happy. You actually have very different kinds of themes that are apparent in your mind. So there's this cognitive aspect which is separate from the process of feeling itself, contributes to, but separate from, that is very much involved with emotion, and which is dependent on other kinds of brain structures. So whereas emotion itself is very much associated with subcortical structures that are below the level of the cerebral cortex, or structures in the cortex that are in the midline, or structures in the brainstem that are in the midline, and that are very close to the regulation of life, all of these other cognitive changes that are part of emotion are related to the lateral cortices. They're related, for example, to the cortices of the frontal lobe on the lateral aspect, as opposed to the ventromedial, and they're related to a variety of cortices, sensory cortices, in the posterior aspects of the brain. Now, and this is very important, this point, so I'm going to read it carefully for you. These emotional programs, what we call emotions, in that three-tier definition that I gave you, are built from simpler programs that exist in ourselves and that have existed for a long time in evolution. In other words, emotions are not something that appeared as a biological product entirely de novo. Emotions are complex. They're complicated too, but they're fundamentally complex mechanisms of reaction that are built from many other components, and they include, for example, the reward and punishment processes, but they are integral components of this. They include scaling of internal needs of the organism. They include, of course, the notion of pain and pleasure. You see, organisms, long before they have emotions in the proper sense of the word, had, in order to navigate life, had mechanisms of reward or punishment. And those mechanisms of reward or punishment were tied to the notion of pleasure, in the case of reward, and pain, in the case of punishment. That existed long before we had something that we could call sadness or happiness or admiration or compassion. So emotions and their components execute homeostatic goals of varied specificity, and they manage something we could call biological value. So what I'm trying to say here, and this is of course extremely compressed because it's a long story, I've written a book about this slide. What I'm trying to say is that when you have an emotion, you are recruiting a variety of mechanisms that came in the long history of evolution long before emotions arose. And those mechanisms all had to do with how an organism manages its life. We have a life cycle from birth to death, with disease intervening generally to cause death. And during that life cycle, there is a mandate that is in our genome to stay alive and manage that life as well as possible. You know, and it is something that is there. This is what Spinoza talked about when he talked about the conatus, this endeavor, this incredible desire to persist and prevail, even when things are going very wrong with your biology. It's something, you know, the dur désir de durer, that is the critical thing that is in this conatus. And that is in the genome. And it is in the genome throughout most of our life, even in very advanced stages of life. It's only when the whole thing breaks down in states of dementia and very, very, very advanced illness and old age that the system breaks down and loses that possibility. So you could say that all of this emotional system that we recognize in other human beings is in fact the latest expression in biological evolution of this desire that is a blind desire that cells have of staying alive. Because keep in mind that the many, many trillions of cells that exist in the body, not just the brain cells, but all the other cells, have this conatus inside their genome. There's one genome inside every cell, which is our genome, and in all of those cells, this prevails. That cell has, within its life cycle, has to stay alive and be homeostatic, has to manage the process of energy acquisition, the process of transformation of energy, and the process of elimination. All of that has to be managed from the inside. And it is there, in this germ of regulation of life, whether at the level of one cell or one tissue or one entire organism with many organs, that you find the genesis of emotions. It's there at this very simple level, connected to reward and punishment, eventually to something that we can call pain and pleasure, when we are able to, as human beings in evolution, to call it by any kind of name, and eventually it has its expression in emotions. So this is, once again, not a luxury. This is what we're made of. And the great news is that we have the possibility of knowing more about what is going on, and therefore controlling the way in which these emotions can be good for us or bad. But the fact that they're there for a purpose is no doubt. And even fear, for example, everybody knows that some of the most disastrous policies of these past 5 years have occurred largely because people were in fear in certain parts of the world. Is that good? Of course not. It's terrible. It's a horrible example of the exploitation of something very natural, which is the emotion fear. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that fear is not physiologically extremely adaptive, because fear probably, in all likelihood, has saved more lives of more organisms than any other kind of device. So it's useful, but sometimes it's not useful. And it is up for us as human beings to have science discover when it's good and when it's not so good. That's what we're trying to do. So, what are feelings? Feelings is very simple. I'm going to give you another very strict definition. Feelings are composite perceptions of, number one, a particular state of the body that is a real state, actual state, or simulated. Number two, a state of altered cognitive resources. And number three, the deployment of certain scripts. So if I tell you that I am happy, what I'm really describing to you is a state of my body in which I feel that I'm light and full of energy and ready to go. And that state can either be really in my body from changes that have occurred, or may have been simulated internally in a platform of our brain that includes the somatosensory cortices, namely the insula, and is generating that in my mind, even if my body may not be quite the way my brain is telling me it is. Okay, that's what the simulation game means here. And I also perceive when I'm happy that I have a state of altered cognitive resources. So my mind is going very fast, and I tend to think slightly less time than I would if I was very sad or very reflective. And I'm learning quite a lot, but I probably will not learn as much as if I were in a less excited state. And I am thinking about things that people call happy thoughts, as opposed to thinking of death and funerals, okay? And all of those things are connected to a particular causative object that is the object of my happiness, and that is what philosophers, just to make us confused, have called intentionality. Okay, so how do we come to feel an emotion? We come to feel an emotion, it's a complicated story that I'm going to make very simple, in one of three ways. Either by changing the state of the body. For example, if now somebody would come in here and tell us that something quite horrible happened, we would feel it in our body, because the effect of surprise and the fact that there was something to be feared and the novelty and unexpected nature of it would probably actually have changes in our body. So our heart rate would change, the gut would contract, there would be changes in temperature, the circulation in our face would change and we might become pale. All sorts of things that really change in the body, and that's one way of producing a feeling. And that is exactly what James had in mind, although he did not call it by the right word. Change your body and then feel, in other words, perceive what changed in your body. But you can do this by altering the transmission. For example, we all know that people that are in battle and are in situations of extreme danger and get, for example, to be wounded, miraculously, and this is a story that is told in war stories very frequently, how somebody can be shot, have a wound that would paralyze any of us, but that person manages to walk away from the danger place and walk away sometimes for long periods and not have pain. And those people report, I was able to run away because I was not feeling pain. Now, how does that happen? It's very interesting. We now know the mechanism. During those periods of extreme danger, there is actually an endogenous opiate that is being secreted at the level of the brain stem by one particular part of a region called the periaqueductal gray, and it's literally producing the equivalent of a narcotic injection for that short period. Not only that, it's also acting down in the spinal cord and disconnecting the signaling so that the communication between the periphery and the central nervous system is interrupted during that period. So, in fact, you are not really feeling pain because the body is not giving you the right signals because the brain has cut off the signals. It's like cutting the telephone lines. So that's one way of having our feelings altered because the body is not signaling properly. And the other is just making it up in simulation. And that's the third one. You create a pattern as if you were being stimulated from the body. So that sort of gives you the panorama. You have all of the execution. This is the so-called body loop. And then the signals go to somatosensing regions, and they're listed there. The most important is an area known as the Insula, which is very critical, probably the central platform for this. And I'm not going to go through all of this very detailed slide, but I just wanted to tell you that we know more and more about the fact that there are numerous routes of information into the brain about the body. Information that has to do with the chemistry, information that has to do with states of the muscles, of the viscera. So the body is giving a full range of information about every department in its organization, and the brain can know about that. And it's very important for you to think why we have this. Because early on, for example, at the time of William James, we had no conception that this was so detailed. And you may say, why do you have all that information? And that's for a very simple engineering reason. For those of you here who like to think in computational and engineering terms, is that you have to think that the brain exists because there is a body. The brain exists to manage the relationship between a body and the surround. And one of the first things that the brain has to do is manage the internal economy. The brain has to deal with what goes wrong in one part or another of the body in order to create all sorts of readjustments of equilibrium. And in order to do that, it needs to be informed. It needs to know what's going on. So these somatosensing systems, like in the hypothalamus or in the upper brainstem or in the insula, are really systems that bring the news about what is going on millisecond by millisecond in whatever part of the body. And you can say that what we have as feelings is really a byproduct of the fact that we have a highly informed brain about what is going on in the body. That's the reason why, if you go back to the early philosophers and you go to every poet, you know that the descriptions of mental states of feeling are always tied to the body. That's why in our natural wisdom, we speak about my heart is aching for X and Y, or I had a gut feeling that this was wrong, or I felt it in my skin, and all of those lovely metaphors that are in fact descriptions of the natural wisdom that we have about what is going on, not only in our mind, but in our brain in our body in relation to the mind. Okay, and I'm going to save you all the detail here, but I just wanted to tell you that in fact we know that the information about the body is so selective that it actually goes very, very much along special channels. And there is information that will go directly to a particular nucleus of the thalamus, to a particular part of the insula, and has to do literally with the interior. And for those of you that think that, well, this is about the mind and the brain at the high level of systems, what has this got to do with cells? Well, it has a lot. And one of the things that is very exciting is that, in fact, you can have chemical markers for the parts of the brain that are most related to information from the interior. So we know that all the parts that have to do with information from the interior actually are cal-binding positive, whether you're looking at them at the level of the spinal cord, or you're looking at them at the level of the trigeminal nerve to bring information from the entire body below the neck and the body in terms of the head and face. And we know that even at the level of the insula, there's that cal-binding versus parvalbumin marking, which is very interesting because, of course, the fact that calcium-binding proteins are connected with these different tracks simply means that these are systems that evolved at different ages with different chemical makeup, and you could have this separation. Of course, we have a way of identifying what goes on in the brain using positron emission tomography or functional magnetic resonance. And I just wanted, since I mentioned the story on depression, that when you have a state of sadness that is induced in the laboratory in an entirely normal person by a very entirely normal stimulus, for example, the person thinking about episodes of sadness in his or her life, you have an involvement of course, the insular cortex is much more active. That's the territory that is connected to all the body mapping, either simulated or transmitted from the body. And you also have a lot of activity in this part of the anterior cingulus gyrus, an area that is known as CG25. And this is the area where a neurosurgeon by the name of Lozano, who works in Montreal, has been able to do electrical stimulation in patients with refractory depression. And when there is stimulation in that area, what happens is that the depression immediately lifts, and people report having this weight taken out of them, and they feel normal. Now, this is still very early to say how long, how much we're going to be able to confirm this story, but it's quite telling that when you, as an entirely normal person, are put in a scanner and think about something very sad that happened in your life, you're normal, you're not depressed, you think about that sad episode, and in some cases you may even be moved to tears during that episode, and then after 3 minutes everything goes back to normal. During that period, this area is in fact hyperactive, among many other areas. This is an area that in structural magnetic resonance scans has now been proven to be thinned out in those structural magnetic scans of people with chronic depression. And this is the area from which the electrical stimulation is also able to lift the depression. So I just wanted to give you this as an example of something that is evolving, where you can bring together very different aspects of traditional psychiatry, neurology, neuroscience, applications with neurosurgery, and it is one of the many ways in which we have to see if we can, in fact, ameliorate the condition of a patient. It's not just drugs. There are many other options of things that can be done. Those are just scans for states of happiness or fear and anger. I'm going to jump over that. There is this system which I call the as-if body loop system, which really allows for this direct simulation bypassing the body, and that's a system for which now there is a remarkable amount of evidence. We do know that this area known as the insula, which is below this level of the cortex, and you see there in the depth, when it is damaged, it really leads to an inability to recreate internally states of your own body, and curiously, it also leads to an inability to empathize with others because there is a block in this function of literally putting yourself in other people's shoes that depends very much on the simulations of our own body. Even research on mirror neurons is in fact giving a tremendous amount of support to this notion of the as-if body loop. And all of it, as I said, is centered on this structure, which is very difficult to see from the outside of the brain. Sometimes you see it just appearing a little bit on the surface, but then as you go inside the brain in transparency, as we're doing here, this is a slide that Hannah worked on in her lab, you see the insula appearing, and it's literally under the surface, but it's still a cortex, and that is a critical structure for the bringing together of body information and a critical structure for all of these simulations of feelings. There was a slide here that disappeared. It told you about information. This is from an experiment with magnetoencephalography, which gives you the timings of this operation. It's very interesting, but the computer doesn't like it, so it's gone. I just wanted to do two more things before I close and entertain your questions. One is to give you the idea, going back to my friend William James, of what is different now relative to William James. Basically, William James talked about this perception of stimulus, body changes, and perception of body changes. And of course, in 1880, he did not know much about the brain, nor could he, but he did know that it was a cerebral cortex, and he imagined that in the case of a visual stimulus, there would be the visual cortex involved in this, and he imagined that there would be a cortex, which had not been very well identified, that would carry out the somatic perception. What we know today can be summarized in this, and it's of course far more complicated because now you have all the detail. Now we know that it's very important not only to perceive the stimulus, but to appraise it. For example, depending on the context in which a stimulus appears, you may or may not respond with the right emotion. For example, you will, if somebody gives you bad news, but you happen to be very, very happy just before, the bad news will not have the same resonance as if you were already prepared for the bad news. And the opposite is true. So the appraisal of the stimulus is very critical. The triggering of action that follows the lines of William James, except that we now have all this detail about where it's happening, in which system, and so on. There is something that is clearly new, which is the notion of internal simulation. And James could not possibly have it, and it's very nice that it exists. But the notion that the perception of the body state was part of the feeling, even if he didn't call it feeling, is very much the James notion, and that is very rich. And now we know that it is not only about the body in the actual state, but about transformations in the representation that goes on in the brain during the emotive period. So obviously, we're a little bit better off than we were 100 years ago. So in conclusion, before I tell you one more story, emotions are action programs, and they precede feelings, which are the perception of action programs. Emotion and feelings operate in multi-stage cycles. This is never about one area that is a center for this or that. It's always about a system. And there are many, many stages. And these things can be modified by context. The intensities may change. And of course, how you were educated and what your individual experience is plays a very important role. And very importantly, emotions reflect the ongoing management of life inside the organism. And I think that feelings are constantly giving you a window into how the body is operating, and in fact, how the entire economy is operated. So, as a consequence, the role of emotion and feeling in biological evolution and the emergence of consciousness are really becoming much more clear. I know I could tell you, but that's not the right time, that probably one of the fundamental influences on the way we evolved comes from the fact that very early on, as a result of certain traits of genes, we were able to deploy very rapidly mechanisms of reward and punishment and mechanisms of scaling of need inside the organism. And it's probably because of that that we evolved the way we evolved. Not just we humans, but many other species before us. And then there's the fact that the role of emotion and feeling in social processes and the creation of social space leads to something that I'd like to call social homeostasis. So, of course, we all know, and this is a great food city. This is, I cannot think about Barcelona without thinking about good food. So let me talk about basic homeostasis around the notion of food. At some point before I shut up, you're going to feel hungry. Probably you're going to feel more hungry because I don't stop talking. And that, it's very interesting because you're going to have a good dinner and will be very well cooked and be very interesting. But it's all about an internal need that even if you would like to suppress, you cannot. You can turn it, you can use great cuisine to make it all more pleasant and appetizing, but basically what you're going to need before too long is some additional energy in your organism. And the way that the organism tells you about that is by declaring a state of hunger and then declaring a state of thirst, or both combined. And if you don't act on it, it's going to make you very uncomfortable and put you in a painful state. So that is biological homeostasis. And then, of course, it will manage the metabolism and do lots of other beautiful things and make sure that your water balance is right and your ionic balance is right. That's what the machine does automatically, and it lets this thing come into consciousness so that you can know what you have to do, and you act on it. But there is an extension of this into social homeostasis, what I like to call social homeostasis. And you can ask, so what is that? Well, it's very simple. It's in fact most of the things that we have been doing in our culture from very early on, beginning with human beings in groups, long before they were interested in painting in caves and creating music or poetry, and they were, or technology for that matter, let alone science, but they were in fact managing and creating social relationships. How do you manage relationships within a small group? Who rules, who commands the group, who follows? How do you create relations within the family? All of these things are part of social homeostasis. And I dare say that most of the things we engage in very passionately, whether they have to do with social and political systems, public policies, whether they have to do with health or poverty or the running of an economy, the creation of systems of justice, the enormous care we give to the notion of medicine and health, all of these are the projections into the social space of our biological needs. Why would we be interested in all of this stuff if it weren't for the fact that whatever the result of all of this is, reflects itself in the welfare of the people who are affected by all of these policies? So it's not that we, perversely want to deal with politics. Is that we have to deal with politics and we have to deal with social policy in order to maintain biological homeostasis. Otherwise, we die. And I think history proves this point. So I think that the fascinating point now is how to transfer some of the knowledge we have about the biology of especially the social emotions into this social space. And I would like to close just with two little examples. And one comes from a very recent study, was published this year in Nature, came out in April, and I think online maybe a month before. And it has to do with an experiment we carried out in normal human beings, as well as in people with brain damage in this territory, which you saw earlier is the territory of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. In other words, a territory where, as a result of the damage, you lose the ability to have social emotions like, for example, compassion or guilt. And what was done in this experiment was to test a number of moral dilemmas that, in fact, have been developed by moral philosophers. And the dilemmas range from social dilemmas that are very simple and can be solved without any kind of high conflict, to dilemmas that pose a hypothetical, of course, but an extremely traumatic conflict-generating conflict. So, for example, one dilemma would be about, very simple, would be about the fact that you may be asked, would you walk down the street and see money just left by somebody that was walking in front of you? Would you find it acceptable to pick up the money and not tell the person in front of you that she or he had lost the money? And what you ask the person, the subject in the experiment, is, do you find this acceptable? And, you know, people respond the way you predict that they will respond to something like that, which is not about great conflict. But then you can ask something like this. Suppose you are, your ship has wrecked, and you are in a boat raft, and that boat raft is actually meant for about 9 people, but you have 12 on the raft, and the raft is sinking, and you sense that everybody's going to perish in there. And you see that there is this guy who's huge, very large man. And so the question is, would you find it acceptable to throw the guy out of the raft? And the guy dies, of course, but the other people are saved. And the interesting thing is that normal individuals massively reject the idea of throwing the guy out of the boat. There are a few, you know, we always have those marvelous people in the society, one or two that said, yeah, I would throw the guy out. But what is interesting is that if you have damage in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, you massively say, I would accept that the guy should be thrown out. It's not that they're doing it themselves, because this is a hypothesis, but they find the hypothesis far more acceptable than other people. So the interpretation that we have produced, and by the way, this has nothing to do with brain damage per se, because you have controls that have lesions of the same size, but in systems that don't involve emotion, and they behave like the normal controls. So this is not about having brain damage. It's about having brain damage in a particular part of the brain, which has to do with these emotions. And so the way we interpret this is that when there is this very high-pitched conflict that really involves harm to someone else, the fact that your emotional system that delivers things such as guilt or compassion for the other is not functioning is going to allow you to operate in a utilitarian mode. Because what you're doing is actually something that, in fact, economists might advocate, do it for the best possible gain in the cost-benefit analysis. So throw the guy out of the boat and save yourself. Why not? And some people think that that's the best way of doing. But the fact is that human beings in general reject that hypothesis and don't find it palatable that in order for the benefit of a few, you can have something as directly confrontational as killing somebody else. So that's the interesting part. So let me, that just shows you the data. And you have the high conflict, all those guys in the red are the ones that endorse the throw the guy out of the window. And I'll just tell you this story. I'll tell you the story. You don't even need to look at the graph. But again, it involves a very similar design with target patients, control patients, and normal participants, except that this time is an investment game. And just to tell you how everything we say about emotion needs to be qualified by the context in which we're talking about. So this is about an investment game, very much like investing in the stock market. And what happens is that in this game, at a certain point, you're going to introduce a big penalty and a huge loss. Exactly what could happen to any of us who invest in the stock market, and one Black Friday comes and suddenly you're wiped out and you lose a tremendous amount. And what happens is that when there is the big loss, the big penalty, most normal individuals stop playing the game and watch carefully until they invest more. Whereas people with damage in the prefrontal cortex, in the ventromedial, continue